Go ahead. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first annual International Cultural Remembrance Symposium. My name is Earl Crittenden, and I'm the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the One Pulse Foundation, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you, whether you're joining us live today or virtually. So thank you, welcome, and thank you for spending the weekend with us. I'm just here to do a couple of housekeeping tips before I hand it over to Dr. Earl. The exits are are this way and out that way. And the bathrooms are down the hall and to the right. As the agenda indicates, this is the General Assembly Room, and you can follow us on the conference tracker. We are live streaming in this room this weekend, but for virtual attendees, the breakout room sessions are pre-recorded and will be made available on the conference tracker app. For our in-person attendees, at each breakout room, a volunteer will scan your badge, and after each session, a survey will be for you to complete in the conference app. We will be providing boxed lunches for you at noon, and you can eat in that room across the hall or outside in the courtyard if it's not raining, but the sessions will restart promptly at 1 o'clock, so please keep track of time. We do encourage participation amongst our attendees, and we will do those in the breakout sessions. But one thing we ask is that everybody please remain respectful to each other. We live in very turbulent times right now, and things can be stressful. So please, let's all remain respectful. If you want to know more about our presenters, you can read about them in the app, and they're very, very interesting and impressive. I'd like to also thank our One Pulse Foundation staff and volunteers that have put this together behind the scenes. They've done a terrific job. And finally, our collaborating partners, which is Cultural Vistas, the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center, and the International Coalitions of Sites of Conscience. And at that point, I will stop talking and hand it over to Dr. Earl to start. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Earl. I'll just start by saying, boy, I've got an allergies going on right now, right? So as much as I love to talk, and I really do love to talk, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to keep it down for a little bit. All right, so I actually serve as the Vice President of Education for One Pulse Foundation. One Pulse Foundation emerged from the June 12, 2016 Pulse nightclub incident. So it serves a mission of building a museum to open minds, a memorial to open hearts, education programs to open eyes, and legacy scholarships to open doors. So that's what we are focused on. My job basically is to advance the mission of acceptance, inclusion, and remembrance into the education program. So let's talk about how this whole symposium got started, right? So I was fortunate enough to participate in a transatlantic exchange program that looks at memorial culture as how it displays itself in Germany and the United States. So Cultural Vistas actually was the one that organized that. And if I'm not mistaken, that was a response to the Rodney King incident. Sorry, not Rodney King. George Floyd, yeah, sorry, George Floyd, thank you, incident. So a lot of things happened. That was an inflection point, right? So Cultural Vistas, they, again, started this, this program. I was selected for it. In that program, it looked at building a diverse and inclusive culture of remembrance between these two countries, right? So something happened in that process. In that process, I was inspired. I was inspired through my cohorts, the interaction, the exchange between us. And I knew that something had to happen because this is important work that needed to move forward. So what is cultural remembrance? Basically, that looks at things that happened in the past and how there's still contemporary problems that we face today. For instance, when we look at the Pulse nightclub incident, right? That happened in Orlando, but we're still seeing that still occurring in society? What did we learn? What did we not learn from that? And why are these things still occurring? So it really, Cultural Remembrance looks at things from a perspective that things that happened in the past are still contemporary issues. So that alone tells you the weight and of importance of why we need to have this conference, this symposium. So my hope is, in doing this, that those that are not doing remembrance work, right, can get inspired, and that those of us that are doing it, we can network together and come up with solutions, next steps, and to try to attack some of these these issues that exist in society. I do want to speak to my collaborating partners. I had a thought. I reached out to Cultural Vistas because, after all, they really championed this whole diversity, acceptance, inclusion, culture of remembrance, right? So I reached out to Cultural Vistas, Emily Comer, right? I was like, Emily, I have an idea. I think that we really need to do a program, a symposium to bring people together, unite people to start doing more work towards this. So Emily said, okay, let's do it. Right? That was the first thing. So they had to look for other partners. So I reached out to my good friends at International Coalition of the Sites of Conscience, to which a few of us are members, and they were on board with this. So then I said, well, I need my local organizations. So I reached out to the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center here locally, and we together collaborated in making this program what it is today. So I just want to thank them as collaborating partners in helping us bring this to fruition. All right, so that's all that I have for now. I'm going to pass it over to Lori, who's going to give us some housekeeping, okay?
Hi, I'm Lori. Earl provided most of the housekeeping, but I just want to officially welcome you. And just to remind you all that because we are live streaming, if you could please put your phone on silent and make sure your computers are silent not to interrupt. I know everybody's asked about Wi-Fi connection, so you will have to connect to Wi-Fi by just clicking guest, and then you'll put your name and you'll fill in all the prompts. If you are visiting us from another country, we are working on an international solution, so stay tuned. So hopefully by tomorrow we'll have that figured out. If you need anything for comfort, I'm your girl. So if you need anything, just let me know, and I'll try to accommodate your needs. As we mentioned, we'll be bringing in lunch around noon, and again, you're free to use any of this space to enjoy your lunch. Tomorrow, if you are attending in person, we ask that you please bring and wear your lanyard, because this will let us know who should be here, and we definitely want you here. So please remember to bring your lanyard. If you want to leave it here, that's perfectly fine. We'll babysit it overnight if you would like. As you have seen, we have a great photographer, so he's going to be taking photos. Those photos will be available at the end of the symposium. And what we'd like to do at the end of today, we're going to do an all-group symposium photo. So immediately concluding our session, Lamont will probably tell us where we're going to meet. And then we'll provide about a 30 to 40-minute networking session for all of you to talk with all the speakers from today. And we're just going to probably just use the space. I'll probably have more information about that. So that's all I have, and just excited to see you all. And I would like to introduce Carly Matthews to come up. She works for the foundation under the education. She's a coordinator for the education. And Carly is going to be introducing our slate of speakers. So here's Carly.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome again. Today I'll be introducing Dr. Joyce Payne. She founded the nationally recognized Thurgood Marshall College Fund in 1987. The TMCF is designed exclusively for exceptional students at the nation's 47 publicly supported historically Black colleges and universities. In 2008 to 2009, she served as executive director of the National Alliance for Public Trust, a new organization committed to advancing principled leadership in American institutions. She accepted this position following her retirement as Vice President of Office for the Advancement of Public Black Colleges and Council of Student Affairs of the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, in cooperation with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. An authority on women's issues in relation to higher education and labor force participation, Dr. Payne has published and presented a number of papers on the pursuit of equality for women and African Americans in higher education. Dr. Payne earned her bachelor's degree from the former District of Columbia Teachers College and her master's and doctorate degrees from the former Atlanta University. She has received honorary doctorates from Lincoln University of Missouri, Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, Kentucky State University, and the University of the District of Columbia, and in 2012 from Central State University. She was inducted into the District of Columbia's Hall of Fame and the National Black College Alumni Hall of Fame. She served on the Board of Trustees of the University of the District of Columbia for 9 years and served for 2 years as the chair of the board. Dr. Payne serves on the Board of Directors of TMCF and of Cultural Vistas, a nonprofit international exchange organization, and formerly on the National Board of AARP and chaired the AARP Foundation. She has traveled extensively in Africa, Asia, South America, and Europe, and recently conducted a fact-finding mission in Singapore, China, Malaysia, Stellenbosch, and South Africa and Taiwan. Without further ado, Dr. Joyce Payne.
Carla, I didn't expect you to read that entire bio, and I always remind folks that I was also the president of my first grade class. And that's probably the beginning of my leadership, even though I had to bribe my opponent with some candy. I was able to win, didn't have any opposition, so I guess we're still doing some of that today. But I'm delighted to be here with you. I am going to stick with the script because I understand I have about 7 minutes. Emily has emphasized that. And so I plan to try to stick with the script. And I'm delighted to be here, delighted to see all of you, and I hope that the conference will continue to be inspiring. I've already been inspired by some of the conversations I've had about DAICOR and the work that we're doing in Cultural Vista. But thank you for that generous introduction anyway, and thank you, Earl, for inviting Cultural Vistas to join you in this endeavor. It's always good to have someone introduce you or engage you in these kind of programs that have similar values and a similar commitment to a society that represents all of the people of the world. This is an exciting time to talk about international culture of remembrance. It's always an exciting time. We were just talking about Arkansas, and the last time I was in Arkansas, I was telling my Clarice that I was very impressed with the fact that they were willing to talk about the history, and it appeared that we were moving forward. And I said, you know, I felt like I was in San Francisco or somewhere, but I understand that that's not necessarily the case. I was around people of like minds, and they were talking my language, so I was quite comfortable. But I'm so pleased with the One Pulse Foundation, and I want to thank you for celebrating over 100 angels massacred and wounded on June the 12th, 2016, one of the deadliest mass shootings in the history of America. The lives and the loves lost should never be forgotten. Let me be honest, I found it very difficult to prepare these remarks following all of the disasters we've seen over the last few weeks. But one of my icons reminded me that in spite of what's going on, he said, speak from the heart, be brief, and sit down. And so I think I can be brief and seated, but I'm not sure that I can speak from the heart given the challenges that we're facing today. My head is enraged by the atrocities that we have experienced, but my heart is very deeply pleased, or deeply bothered rather, with the young people that we've seen murdered over the last few weeks, the beautiful lives that we lost, the innocent children. And anyone who loses a life, whether it's an adult or a child, is always a catastrophe. But when you see children calling their parents and calling for help, you can't help but be human. And those of us who aren't responding to that kind of atrocity, I would say, are not necessarily human. But these are not new issues for this country. We have been fighting this since the beginning of this country, and especially over the last 25 years. But let me get back to my challenge. Earl asked me to talk about education, and I'm going to try to do that. I want to answer one simple but profound question. What's an education for? What is it for if we can't work our educational process more directly or tie it more directly to the realities of global leadership, to the realities of 1 billion people with no access to a telephone, and let alone Google or Yahoo, 700 million people suffering from hunger, 900 million with no access to clean water, and we've experienced that right here very recently, 700 million barely living off of less than $2 a day. What is an education for if we can't tackle the issues of hatred, hunger, health, poverty, and neglect around the world? I want to applaud One Pulse for working on these issues, for your extraordinary work in connecting education to these issues and the issues of liberty and justice that made this country's values great, values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and have the same rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Harvey Milk said, no matter how hard you try, you cannot erase the words from the Declaration of Independence. While we can't erase those words, are we embracing them as educators, catalysts, and creators of change? More than ever, we must remain resilient and resolute in building a coalition that is pro-well-being, pro-liberty, and pro-remembrance. We must work together in affirming the sacredness of all men while conducting the bold work of producing a new generation of global leaders, primed to contribute to the well-being of society and the world. Through international exchanges, Cultural Vistas has a portfolio of more than 30-plus programs designed around leadership, career readiness, and social responsibility. Annually, we engage more than 6,000 people, young people, middle-aged, across the world, in global skill-building experiences in the U.S. and more than 135 countries. We have an alumni community in 130 countries working together to challenge the status quo. Partnerships with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund that I created in 1987 and other progressive organizations is a testament to our commitment to diversity. The Thurgood Marshall College Fund supports 47 universities. As was mentioned earlier, we're in 22 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We serve 300,000 students and represent 200 years of remembrance, 200 years of fighting those issues that we continue to fight today. But in spite of that, we are continuing to celebrate remembrance. And I don't need to remind you of the challenges that higher education is facing today. The 1619 Project, the reality that this country was a prime subject in terms of slavery. I don't need to remind you of that, but we continue to celebrate that and make sure that our students and others understand the power of history. Through leadership and learning, Cultural Vistas and the Fund are promoting a celebration of remembrance, democracy, diversity, cultural competency, and social justice from a global perspective. Our vision is to not only create talent, but to produce talent that understands that education cannot be separated from the history of America, from the health and vitality of the nation and the world. We must recognize that we have to connect ideas, we have to connect people. We connect young, educated people who have experienced an international travel to opportunities. We know that they are more likely to not only appreciate the value of diversity, but become advocates in assuring that these values are paramount in all that they do. They understand the connection between greenhouse emissions in the US, droughts in Africa, and tsunamis in Turkey and Greece, the connection between the fight for gay rights in the US and the continued struggle for gay rights in Uganda. They understand the connection between the challenges to democracy here in the US and the struggle for freedom in Ukraine. They understand that democracy cannot survive in a country that uses homophobia, xenophobia, antisemitism, simply for power and greed. They understand regressive politics of protecting AR-15s rather than protecting innocent children, protecting those who ignite cultural wars rather than protecting the right to love who we love. While we face a monumental crisis in America, it's also an opportunity for those who embrace, celebrate, and memorialize the sanctity of life, for us to join hands in solidarity, join the support of the Remembrance Museum, provide the kind of resources they need to make it real, to make it operational. And as Earl said, a museum that will open hearts, open minds, open eyes, and open doors of opportunity for a new social order. Truly, this is no time for business as usual. When I was asked to bring remarks, I was still reflecting on the many lives lost over the last 25 years. Columbine in '99, Sandy Hook in 2012, George Floyd, and Tamir Rice. It's difficult to bring a message of hope for a better future with 21 innocent children slaughtered in an elementary school, or grandmothers and grandfathers killed in racially motivated mass shootings, in Buffalo. Today, the fierce urgency of now demands that America understands what's an education for. America that is willing to invest in the sanctity of life rather than the proliferation of guns, that protects the grand aspiration of global democracy rather than demagoguery. Today, more than ever, we are summoned, we in this audience, we in this country, those of us of like minds, those of us who understand the value of a progressive society. We are the architects of a new culture of remembrance that celebrates the hopes and dreams of one world community invigorated by the power of education and the power of love for people and the planet we all share. Thank you for this opportunity, and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. That was very, very inspiring, by the way. All right, so we have up next in our introductory session is Ed Linenthal, Emeritus Professor, Department of History at Indiana University. Edward T. Linenthal is Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. He served as editor of the Journal of American History from 2005 to 2016. He has been a Sloan Research Fellow in the Arms Control and Defense Policy Program at MIT, where he did the research for his first book, Symbolic Defense: The Cultural Significance of the Strategic Defense Initiative. He is also the author of Sacred Ground: Americans and Their Battlefields, Preserving Memory: The Struggle to Create America's Holocaust Museum, and the Unfinished Bombing: Oklahoma City in American Memory. He has co-edited several books, including History Wars, the Enola Gay and Other Battles for the American Past with Tom Engelhardt, American Sacred Space with David Chester, and most recently, The Landscapes of 9/11, A Photographer's Journey, with art historian Christine Gruber and photographer Jonathan Hyman. Linenthal has served as a visiting scholar for the National Park Service and for almost a decade was a member of the Flight 93 Memorial Commission. For several years, he co-directed a Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History Summer Teacher Seminar, 9/11 and American Memory, at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York. He also serves on an advisory committee for memorialization of those murdered in the July 22nd, 2011 terrorist attack in Norway. It is my pleasure to introduce Ed Linenthal.
Thank you, Dr. Earl, and good morning, everyone. I appreciated the fine words that set this conference in some context in such a dark time. I, too, am going to remain chained to a script, so I don't go over my time. Lori said I would be on double secret probation if I did that, and I really don't want to. So I've, as Dr. Earl said, had the opportunity to be a student of and write about a number of major memorial projects. My good friend James Young, who is, I think, the most brilliant scholar of memorialization, characterized himself once as a biographer of memorial processes. And that finally gave me the words when people asked, what did I do, that I could finally say something like that. It's very strange to be kind of at the end of a career and look back and ask, to what end memorialization, and not come up with really satisfactory answers, because the bottom line is that memorials are supposed to put the weight of remembrance on us. And we've become so good now at using technology to bring us into or bump up against these experiences that we're memorializing, and listen to the stories of those most effective. But the point, it seems to me, that kind of gets lost is we're not supposed to become experts at memorializing horrible things. We're supposed to stop the damn horrible things from happening. So what's the link, and I don't know the answer to this, what's the link between memorialization, sparking conscience, and public policy? Now, some of this depends upon the moral qualities of those making policy. And I won't say any more about that. So, I have mixed feelings about commemorative occasions. I don't think that the torrent of commemorative rhetoric that has emerged in response to, for example, the horrors of the Oklahoma City bombing or the 9/11 attacks has helped us much struggle with the toxic after effects of such violence. Instead, the endless parade of words, mostly cheap grace, I think, is often a strategy of containment. Terms used far too easily. The triumph of the spirit. Closure. The most awful word in the English language, right? But when a reporter asked a mother of murdered children in Oklahoma City at the dedication of the memorial in 2000, well, have you reached closure now that the memorial's done? What the hell is she supposed to say? Yes, my daughter was murdered and I'll never see her again, but I really love the memorial, so life is fine, everything's wonderful. What do we expect when we ask people these kinds of questions? Healing process, as if there is this coherent process through which people go, right? Misapplying Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of accepting death or not. These offer cheap grace, I think, in the guise of profound commemoration. Might the rush to commemorate before the depth of the wound even registers? Isn't that a form of commemorative forgetting? Where the blood wasn't even dry yet, in so many places before we start talking about healing. How about we respect and stand in awe of the violence that these events bring about? Is there too often a desire to create a memorial so that we do not have to actively engage these shattering events ourselves, but we consign them to the memorial bookcase and expect the memorial to do our remembering for us? Think, for example, of the formulaic phrases, never forget or never again, that have most visibly been attached to our responses to the Holocaust, but of course now to far too many other things as well. Is there really any stable meaning to these? Does never forget, for example, mean we should always remember the historical roots of the rise of National Socialism, the mix of religious, racial, and pseudoscientific anti-Semitism that was an essential part of its worldview, the reality of a war that fueled what became the inexorable move toward the final solution? I don't think it means that for most people. Does it mean we should never forget those millions who were murdered? Perhaps, but since few, perhaps none of us knew any of them, what does it mean to never forget them? When I am confronted by the Tower of Faces in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, some of you remember that if you've been there, the incredible faces that go 3 floors. The photographs of those murdered in the Polish village of Ashiski, and many of them, looking directly at you. This was, I think, a breathtaking inclusion in the museum. Professor at Brooklyn College, Yaffa Eliak, who was a survivor of the village, these are her photographs. And when they were installing them, she would say, for example, no, those two people hated each other. You can't put their photographs together. But they personalize in so many ways. Whenever I'm in the museum and I reflect on this, I think of the overwhelming power of evil to take lives that can never be recovered, of members of future generations never born, and I feel an incredible impotence to do anything about any of it. When we use the phrase never again, don't we consign genocide to one place, one time, one historical evil? A more honest, but certainly more troubling, commemorative question is, will it ever stop? Further, as historian Peter Novick asked in his important book, The Holocaust in American Life, if an event does not rise to the level of the Holocaustal, does that mean we don't pay as much attention to it? Dark brooding, however, is not often the popular choice for commemorative production. Must commemorative production be necessarily inspirational? Can it engage difficult, even indigestible realities, past and present? Unless we assume that the work of remembrance is by definition healing, in my experience, intense remembrance can be divisive as well as unifying, subversive as well as inspirational. I think about often, there's a wonderful story, some years after the Battle of Bunker Hill, veterans were brought together to help plan a commemorative program, and their memories were so radically different that they had to cancel the proceedings. Too often the reassuring language of preferred narratives, it's one of my favorite phrases, dominates commemorative rhetoric. I think so often of Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer's stark warning, and this is something that I read in one of his papers years ago, and Larry's words have stayed with me throughout all of my projects, really. when we write of martyrs instead of victims, focus on resistance instead of mass murder, invoke the dignity of the self and ignore its humiliation, we are initiating the evolution of preferred narratives that use embattled words to build buffers of insulation against the terrors of the Holocaust or other events, without bringing us any closer to its complex and elusive truths. For me, a revealing example of such comforting narratives was President Bill Clinton's speech at the dedication of the Oklahoma City National Memorial on April 19th, 2000, 5 years after the bombing. I was there, of course, to listen to this. In the unfinished bombing, Oklahoma City in American Memory, I noted that Clinton said, and these are his words, "There are places in our national landscape so scarred by freedom's sacrifice that they shape forever the soul of America. Valley Forge, Gettysburg, Selma, this place is such sacred ground." In response, I wrote, "These people's lives were not given in an act of conscious sacrifice for their nation. They were taken in an act of mass murder. The landscape to which Oklahoma City is connected is not Valley Forge, Gettysburg, and Selma, but sites of political terrorism and mass murder. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, the McDonald's in San Diego, Columbine High School, and so many now. I mean, it would break my heart to write the list here. So many recent others that haunt and torment us." Wondering if my criticism was too harsh, I sent my words to Pam Witcher, the wife of a Secret Service agent murdered in the bombing in Oklahoma City, who had just moved from Washington to Oklahoma City shortly before. Pam and her daughter were wise presences for me throughout my immersion in that story. And in response to my question, she offered a remarkably courageous statement. Her husband, she wrote, and these are her words now, was always prepared to defend the innocent or put his life on the line to protect. He was given the opportunity to do neither in this situation. I believe we heal better when we accept the truth. This was nothing more than a damn waste of lives. All the more worthy of our heartbreak, and the families, all the more worthy of our sympathy. How do our commemorative events make room for this kind of incredible moral courage? Often, changing interpretations, clashing narratives, and voices excavated from a forgotten past threaten comfortable stories that have rarely, if ever, been challenged. And for many people, these original interpretive stories, the power of first interpretation, we might say, it's like they become self-evident, they become naturalized, right? It's like the air we breathe, and how can you, it's like trying to change the laws of gravity. This is, I think, the conviction, and public historians hear this all the time, the expression, "it's a well-known fact," right? And it's like, yeah, well, I learned in 6th grade that XXX, and now you're telling me, no, it's a well-known fact. No, as historians engage new evidence, ask different questions of familiar sources, make uses of scientific advances, they are attacked as, are you ready for a dirty word? Revisionists, which in the eyes of the attackers signifies a crass surrender to the whims of current social or political fashion and an irresponsible, almost criminal willingness to jettison what they consider to be true history. Such attacks are bolstered by the moral odium the term revisionism acquired when linked to those who deny the reality of the Holocaust. These people are not, however, revisionists. They are deniers. But the accusation remains lamentably an effective rhetorical weapon to hurl at those who, for example, want to talk about enslaved people instead of servants during tours of plantation. Wanting to call revisionists those who want people to enter the big house not through the front door and not talk about the furniture and the drapery, but to enter through the back door and talk about the kitchen and who in fact made these plantations run. Those who want to look beyond the iconic mushroom cloud of the atomic age into the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. Those who want to spur our moral imagination by moving beyond comfortable and comforting narratives and engage visitors more thoughtfully. It is crucial, I believe, for public historians to articulately, passionately, and directly confront this attack. And we have done an absolutely horrible job of doing this. And we can share the thoughtful words of the historian of the American West, Patricia Limerick, who writes, these are wonderful words, Patty is amazing. Every normal human being is forever recalculating, reorienting, reorganizing information and reaching for new understanding. Thus, if you know a historian who is not a revisionist, indeed, if you know any human being in any line of work who is not rethinking, reappraising, and revising her or his previous assumptions, then charity requires you to summon the paramedics and get that non-revisionist examined fast on the chance that there might still be time to get this party's heart restarted. Would we, for example, expect historians who focus on the Holocaust to turn away from newly opened archives in Eastern European countries after the breakup of the Soviet Union? Wouldn't we look at them oddly and think them betraying their professional research obligations if we heard one of them say, I would love to go and immerse myself in the archives just open because they contain documents that will, and indeed have, shed light on issues we do not understand, particularly in the Eastern European Baltic world? Alas, I can't do it because that might cause me to revise our understanding of the Holocaust, and that would make me a revisionist. And we know how horrible that is. In his fine book, Gettysburg, Memory Market and an American Shrine, historian Jim Weeks wrote, Gettysburg is an ongoing project with no final meaning, an American shrine in a continuous state of becoming. That can stand for what all historians do, the practice of history, which is an enduring conversation with no final meaning in a conscious state of becoming. In other words, historians leave their rooms messy. The beds aren't made, there are pizza boxes in the closet, but on we go with our work. Historians still find really important, ignored topics to write about using familiar evidence. One of the best examples, Margaret Peggy Creighton's superb book, The Colors of Courage, Gettysburg's Forgotten History, Immigrants, Women, and African Americans in the Civil War's Defining Battle. If you want to read a superb example of how a historian revises history, not necessarily by finding new evidence, but turning and taking seriously lots of stuff that we haven't taken seriously. Diaries from women who lived in Gettysburg, the stories of free African Americans in Pennsylvania who were impressed into slavery by the Army of Northern Virginia as they moved through Pennsylvania. It recasts the battle in her words. When we see the battle through the eyes of immigrant soldiers, we come to know the Union Army at Gettysburg less as a seamless fighting body engaged with an enemy than as a socially divided set of men beset by internal battles. When we measure Gettysburg by the yardstick of women's work, the battle's geography shifts distinctly. The circumference of battle expands beyond the familiar cemetery and seminary ridge to include both the borough and civilian farms for miles and miles around. Seen from the vantage point of civilian women, the battle's chronology also changes. The trauma lengthens from 3 days' worth of killing to at least 3 months' worth of recovery administration. Viewed through the lens of African American experience in Pennsylvania, the Battle of Gettysburg expands again, both a momentary explosion in 1863 and the climax of decades of threat from below the Mason-Dixon line. It is also less about soldiers fighting soldiers in white man's combat than it is about soldiers preying on civilian. And it has clear and urgent moral proportions. It is a battle all about, utterly about freedom. I mentioned just one other book, if you want a great example of, excuse me, historical revisionism with Civil War. Mark M. Smith's superb book, The Smell of Battle, The Taste of Siege, a sensory history of the Civil War. How, when we look at smell and touch and taste, for example, does the war change in such interesting ways? It's incredibly fascinating. I have quite mindfully used the phrase today, commemorative production, in this essay. Official commemorative events are owned and operated for specific purposes by particular interests. There are also, of course, sometimes counter-commemorative events, and we need to pay attention to those. At the Little Bighorn, for example, formerly called Custer's Last Stand, at the Little Bighorn, without question, the most controversial historic site in the United States until about 20 years ago, expressed a patriotic orthodoxy that ruled the commemorative events, that centered on George Armstrong Custer and the men of the 7th Cavalry. Through commemorative rhetoric, theater, poetry, art, and film, the dominant interpretation was that Custer and his men died a sacrificial death and that their blood helped open the American West to civilization. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho existed only at the margins of commemorative production as, of course, savages raging against the inexorable forces of civilization. But after the volatile centennial events in 1976, when Native Americans staged demonstrations and produced their own commemorative events, the National Park Service, stewards of the site since 1940, confronted a host of razor's edge issues. How could they transform what was in large regard a shrine to Custer and the cavalry into a historic site that offered responsible interpretation of all Americans who fought there? And how could this be accomplished when the focal point of the battlefield was Last Stand Hill? Where one stands determines what one sees. And it's very different to stand in the former Native American village of about 4,000 people and imagine Reno's troops riding in than it is to stand on Last Stand Hill, unquestionably a dramatic but only one ideological geographic point to see the battle. Numerous other changes have transformed that site, and it's a kind of textbook, I think, for how the National Park Service in its stewardship of historic sites have struggled with creating a historic site of integrity. The site's name was changed from Custer Battlefield National Monument to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Even more importantly, the dedication of the Indian Memorial in 2003 grounded a more inclusive appreciation of the battle and the many Americans who fought there. Names become really important, don't they? The Sand Creek Massacre Site, which is now a part of the National Park Service, It's very different to call it the Sand Creek massacre site than the Sand Creek battle site, isn't it? There's a world of interpretive difference in using those terms. Well, I think I'm coming to the end of my time. Laura, see, she's holding the double secret probation document in her hand. So 2 more minutes to conclude, Lori? All right, thank you. Where do I want to go? Yes. I often think of the commemorative challenge offered to post 9/11 America by the marvelous Chilean expatriate writer Ariel Dorfman, a challenge that still seems sadly far from being met. And this is a challenge I mentioned in my very first talk at the Flight 93 Memorial Task Force before those of us went on the federal commission. Might those of us, Dorfman asks, living in the most modernized society in the world, be able to connect in ways that would have been unthinkable before September 11th, 2001, to the experience of so many hitherto inaccessible planetary others? How will we respond to this challenge? To find, Dorfman writes, ways to make this new global tragedy draw us all closer to each other, not because we can now kill one another more easily and with more devastating effects, but closer because we share the same need to mourn, the same flesh that can be torn, the same impulse toward compassion. Thank you.
Thank you. So hang in there. How you all doing? Everybody good? All right. So now you're in for a treat. We have our first keynote panel, and I would like to have Dr. Joyce Payne join me up here, as well as our panel. I'd like to have the panelists come up to the front. Dr. Earl Mowat, Sulan Hopman, and Clarice Abdul-Bey. And I believe they'll be providing a short introduction when they do the panel. So come on in.
We'll pull this a little closer. Yes. You know, I understand the fact that we have to stick with the timelines, but, you know, there's some things that you just feel like you need to continue to have that conversation. And Ed just opened a whole new area of conversation here. And what stands out for me, is the fact that it doesn't make any difference if we simply build another museum unless we have embraced those issues and those values that are represented by that museum. And so those of us who will be the architects of the future can't allow that to continue to happen. You know, I don't want another museum unless, in fact, we can change the world. You know, I don't want another museum or recognition or more pain that we won't forget unless, in fact, we can all become the architects of a new future. And so I think that's what we're here today to talk about. And so I will leave it to the young people in the audience to take on that mantle. I am very impressed with the kind of activism I have seen on our college campuses, and I encourage them to continue. We have to have those voices in the conversation as well. We haven't included many of those voices. We're very comfortable, Earl, about talking about the issues. For example, I was with Reverend Barber recently, who has mobilized the country around poverty. And what he pointed out is that in too many cases, we have those conversations, but there's nobody at the table representing the kind of struggle that folks face each and every day. But let me get back to the script again. And we are here to not only talk about diversity and inclusion, remembrance and the global community and how we can shape that global community. But we have representatives on the panel who are shaping it each and every day, and through DAICOR, which is an international transatlantic, that's redundant, but a transatlantic cultural exchange opportunity. I understand from Clarice that it was virtual, unfortunately, and so, Emily, I think we have an obligation to make sure that they can actually touch the world that they live in, the people who live there, and so we will continue to work on that opportunity. And perhaps I can go with you, especially if you're in Barcelona or Stellenbosch, I'll join you. I'm going to allow you to introduce yourselves. You already know Earl, so why don't we start with Clarice?
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm very honored to be here with all of you. Earl, this was my fellow cohort, the 2021 DAICOR group. And so Earl said he was going to do this. He wanted to, it was very small first, wasn't it? He wanted to start just a little website. He wanted to have just a page on the Pulse Foundation's website so that we can all go to it and add our information and kind of dialogue. And then it went from that to this. And so I'm just really happy that you went ahead and pushed that baby out and made this happen. My name is Clarice Abdul-Bey. Not only am I an alum of DAICOR, but I am one of the co-founders and directors of the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, which is in partnership and collaboration with the Equal Justice Initiative out of Alabama. And that particular EJI, as a lot of you know, deal with the culture and memorial space of lynchings in America and also mass incarceration with young folks. And so I would say back in, I think it was about 2018, so my background is not scholarly per se, it's more activist, advocate, because I've always been in the community, I've always tried to mentor our youth, and I've always tried to be mobile when it comes to issues, especially racial and diversity issues. But I think the spark that really lit a fire in me was just a regular family trip. Decided to go to EJI's grand opening. We didn't get a chance to go, but then we went. I don't know if you know the history of Arkansas, but it's one of our dirty South areas. And we have a lot of racial issues that are not tackled. They're kind of pushed to the side, and we continue on. We decided to go. When we went, we learned a lot. We learned that there were over 493 victims of racial terror lynchings in our state. We were top 3 or 4. And so historically, my family is from the Delta, and my great-grandfathers and grandfathers were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And so they saw the history of that injustice and trying to survive and live under racial terror. And so they lived in Elaine. Most of you know about Elaine, the Elaine race massacre of 1919. They did not experience that, but they still were in that area and experienced that. So it hit me to know that we were 3rd or 4th in the country. And so I looked over to my partner and I said, we have to do something, don't you? And he said, yes. So Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement was born from it. And we're still pushing on right now. I'm a mom. I'm a daughter. I just this movement has been life-changing for me. And instead of working directly with the young folks, which I do with our students, and I think for me it's very important that they are involved, because they then take what we're doing and they continue the work when we go on and we get tired and we need to become mentors. They then take up the mantle to continue the work. So educating and working with them is important. So that's what I'm trying to do, is work more with students to be more involved in the culture of remembrance and this particular movement. I hope that answered some of your questions.
We're going to skip you, Earl.
Oh, that's right.
I think I even have my own.
Oh, go right. Well, you can hold that. Suen, introduction.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation again, and I'm really happy that finally I can actually be here and meet you in person, just because it was virtual last year. So, yeah, my name is Sulan
I'm
Hopman.
going to interrupt you for
Yeah.
one moment. I was about to complain to Selene about my travel from North Carolina, but she came in from Germany, so we must applaud her.
Yeah, so my name is Sulan Hopman, and since October 2021, I am the lead for a project which is called Decolonize Hamburg of the Ministry of Media and Culture in Hamburg, Germany. And one of my main objectives there is to write a decolonial concept, or a concept for a decolonial culture of remembrance for the city of Hamburg. And I don't do that alone, though. So we work a lot with civil society groups, with local administration, and also activists, and also experts in the fields of science and education and culture, obviously. And one of the things it includes is that there are a lot of contested monuments also in Hamburg. And so one of the questions is also how to deal with these contested monuments, what should or could we do with them?
Earl?
Oh, yeah. Just to extend on this, right? First of all, it's I can't express what it feels like to have my cohort here in Orlando, Florida, because we did a lot of this communication, this exchange virtually online. So to see us all come together on this as promised, it's just really inspiring and amazing. But that aside, I'm just here on Pulse Foundation, again, advancing that, acceptance and inclusion into remembrance culture. And that's what this is all about. Thank you.
I want to go back to Clarice, and before the program this morning, I mentioned in my remarks that I was under the impression when I visited Pine Bluff, Arkansas, that represented all of Arkansas, and quite impressed with the kind of dialogue that was taking place. But based on the experience I have in North Carolina, I shared that with Clarice, that when I moved from my hometown, D.C., to North Carolina, I had friends of mine calling saying, Joyce, have you lost your mind? You're going across 14th Street to the south? And Washington, D.C. is the South, and I had to remind them that we don't have a monopoly in the South over slavery and brutality and xenophobia. When you talk about the kinds of things that Ed has mentioned, slavery was supported by New Yorkers, and the ships were being built in Rhode Island. So let's be honest about this economic system that my body became a part of that economy. And so we have to be real about the history of this nation and understand how we can use that history to make a difference. I was with some young women from Nigeria recently who were talking about some of the struggles, and they reminded me that Shirley Chisholm said, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair. And I said, no, don't bring a damn chair, build your own damn table. And then you decide who sits at the table. You decide who brings the chair. And so that's what we're talking about, and that's what Ed has referred to, and that's what Clarice is doing. And you don't have to be a scholar to be an activist. And we need more activism. We need the scholars that Ed talked about to be much more of an activist, to understand the power of the truth. And, but I should get back again. I'm looking at Emily. Emily reminded me that I should also let all of you know that DAICOR is open for applications again. And we think we can actually put you in Berlin. We think we can actually put you in Hamburg and in Barcelona and some of those places to make a difference. We're also expanding to create opportunities in Africa, a rich resource that too many of us have not had an opportunity to experience. But beyond all of my rhetoric, let's talk a little about how do we tie, Sue, your experience in Hamburg in relation to the kind of struggles we're facing here in the country and the whole notion of using your activism, your involvement in education to make a difference in terms of remembrance.
Well, I think what I thought was one of the most interesting things last year when we had the program was when one of our fellow, one of our fellows, her name was Candice. I have to look at this. Candice Bacchus Hollingsworth. She told us about that there are actually 5 steps of memorization and truth-telling. And I still remember that just because it made the different steps so clear, and I think it also connects with what you said. Because the 5 steps, she said, is first of all, resolution. So you have to acknowledge that, you have to acknowledge certain facts. Then examination, so you have task forces, usually commissions, committees, so you discuss. And then there's the phase of recommendations, which is followed by actions and then by implementation. And I thought that it was, for me, I think about that a lot, especially now that I work for the Ministry of Media and Culture, and we work a lot on policies. And I think it just made the process so clear that you have to follow, or that you have to go through different phases in memorization, and you can't really skip them. And right now we are in the process of dealing with a giant monument, which is the largest monument of Otto von Bismarck, the back then Chancellor of the German Empire. And it's 34 meters high, so it's really gigantic. And there was a lot of protest going on about this monument, just because the city of Hamburg started to renovate this monument right in 2020, so when Black Lives Matter was going on. And they are spending 13 million euros in renovating this monument. And Otto von Bismarck was the one who convened all European colonial powers in 1884 to draw up the borders that the African continent still has today. So obviously there was a lot of discussion going on about that. And I think about the 5 steps, or about the 5 phases a lot, just because looking back at the procedure, or at the process that started in 2020, I think we are now in phase 3 or 4. And what made it really interesting for me to join our exchange was to see, especially how in phase 5, so when you implement what you have discussed before, that there are so many varieties in how you implement what you have discussed, that it's really inspiring to see all these differences, and also to realize that it's very, very time and place specific how you have to implement the discussions going on about memorialization.
Clarice, are there any lessons from that discussion that you could replicate in your movement in Arkansas?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's funny that Sulin was talking about, you know, the monuments and the markers and things like that. We had an ongoing discussion, debate almost about whether statues and things should continue to be erected, or should they stay? Should they go? What do we do? Are we creating stories around them? I think we were split. Were we not split in that thought process about whether we would need to take them down or keep them up and create a broader conversation with our narratives? And so that was a big thing for us, and it was very interesting to talk about. I think the processes of what we learned in DAICOR and how to implement, like Sulin was saying, are subjective, like you talked about, and depending on where you are in the world and how you go about doing them. For us, because we know the history of Arkansas and how things it's an upswell. And I was talking to Dr. Joyce earlier, and I was saying it's like an inflammation that happens all of a sudden because we haven't really dealt with the past. And it's very present in policy now, and what has been enacted, and what our representatives and people who make these laws and the good old boy systems that are still in place. There's this inflammation of racial injustice that happens in and out of Arkansas that we can't get past. And I think it's hard to tell what to do, but it is very important that you do it based on the history of where you live. And that's pretty much all I can say about that. We implement things based on legislation that is enacted in our states, the way that the leaders conduct themselves, based on our communities, and our cultural sensitivity to the communities, I think, is how we try to move, if that answers the question.
Clarice, I understand that you're trying to change legislation and have policy directives that are much more progressive. At the same time, I can't ignore the fact that, for example, and I know the black population in Arkansas, that we had 40 million eligible voters in this nation in terms of black Americans, and only 30 million of us voted. And so we aren't about to see a change unless, in fact, we can educate folks to understand the value and the power of the vote. And, you know, I know that this is not a political forum, but the reality is there will be no policy change unless we are much more aggressive in making sure that those individuals who are public servants represent the agenda that we have interest in. And so, and I'm not very persuaded that we're doing enough even today to make sure that young people and African Americans and women, I'm talking to so many people who are into the rhetoric of the day, and some people who I thought were quite progressive, and at the same time don't see the connection between the proliferation of guns or the reproduction issue. That's a major issue right now. I mean, we want to force women to make decisions about having a child, but we don't want to give them school lunches. We don't want to give them extended Medicare and health services. And so there are all of these contradictions. And so somehow we have to change the narrative, it seems to me, Ed, and call it what it is. If it's a massacre, call it a massacre.
Absolutely.
If it's a killing, call it a killing. You know, if it's a neglect, if it's racist, call it what it is. I think we have been much too gentle, much too scholarly in addressing these issues rather than saying exactly what it is. I spoke at a prison not too long ago, and I was so impressed with the fact, and I won't mention this university, but these young men were much more aware of what's going on in the Supreme Court than the university class that I participated in. The majority of the students in that classroom were either on their telephones or simply ignoring the professor. And I said to the professor, I grew up in the 60s. We would bodily move professors from classrooms if they weren't addressing the issues that we felt were important. I saw a passivity on that campus that is intolerable in the educational process because it's an exchange of ideas, it's an exchange of dialogue, even if you don't agree, having the opportunity to have those debates. And so I don't know whether some of our young people have spent so much time in technology that they can't find the courage to speak out and to challenge their professors. Because education is not simply my opinion. It's about the dialogue and coming to a point where we can find common ground. And so DAICOR is about finding common ground globally. It's about looking at opportunities to replicate ideas that we can use to change the future of this nation. I am very impressed with some of the young people who are engaged in grassroots activities, but I do think we have a responsibility to bring them into the conversation. And Earl, rather than, I'm not a panelist here, I'm supposed to be moderating, but talk a little about what are some of the challenges you see that we can use in terms of DAICOR, Cultural Vistas, or some of the other grassroots and affinity groups that we're affiliated with.
Okay, so I think, first of all, to connect what you were saying, yes, absolutely. We have to go hard on the topic, right? We can't sugarcoat things if we want to get change. We have to, if it's a massacre, call it a massacre. When we sugarcoat things, then you're not going to get change because it starts to sound too nice, right? Like a better term. So we have to really go hard on these topics. So one of the things that emerged from DAICOR, a couple of things actually, is one, a lot of the history that we know is heritage, right? So we have to make that fundamental understanding. It surprised me, or I got a sense of understanding of that through the program, where we looked at all of these monuments, right, of Confederate heroes. Well, they lost the war. Why are they being, immortalized in these statues and monuments, right? Because now that sends a false narrative, right? So we've got to kind of bring that back home and have these hard conversations to really understand history, right? Through the program, we talked a little bit about Pulse, but we also talked about what the other cohort members were doing, and things just started stirring. Even how we're doing it here, for instance, right? The narrative, let's take Pulse for instance, right? I had the absolute pleasure and honor of being on the radio with a survivor. This was last weekend, right? So this survivor was able to talk about Pulse in a manner that I haven't heard, because her ability to nuance what Pulse meant to the community took it out of the clinical terms of, oh yeah, it was a place of, it created a sense of belonging and all this, right? And she just brought a different dimension to it. So here's the thing, right? I learned all this from DAICOR of how we do. It's not always told in one perspective. It's told in different perspectives. We really want to understand our history. So I said, well, that's something that needs to be included in a narrative, because it takes it out of the clinical understanding of what Pulse meant to the community into a really more nuanced and more understanding. And for us to understand what Pulse meant, we have to know it from that term of what it meant to the community. The culture of Pulse was built by these people, right? So that gets left out of the narrative, right? But that's such an important part. And the last thing that I would have to say about, culture of remembrance and how even going through the DAICOR program kind of gives you a different way of understanding it. We talked about inclusion, exclusion through the program, right? Well, here's the other thing, and this is how it affects society, these things that's going on now. I did a content analysis of media articulations, right, of the population that was impacted by Pulse, the massacre. Very few of the media articulations spoke about that population. The population was Hispanic, people of color. That falls out the narrative. So now if that falls out the narrative, everything else is going to collapse and implode, right? Because the people that's been affected is not going to be represented. So here's how it goes when we talk about culture of remembrance, right? So we did a program, and there was a rally, queer folks that rallied to talk about anti-gun violence. And what emerged from that was that the people that were impacted, the LGBTQ community that was impacted, right? Well, they didn't really value, in a sense, the population that was impacted because it was an already marginalized population. So they did not go forward with the attack on against anti-gun violence, right? But think about how we talk about gun violence, right? You got to look at that situation to see what's going on now, right? So is it the value why we have these things that still propagate through society? Go back to how that was. It was because, go back to Pulse, right? That population wasn't valued. And this is why remembrance culture is so important, right? Because it's predicting patterns. So are we really valuing the populations now that's been impacted? Well, I say if we go back to Sandy Hook, right? You had this population, but it happened again, right? Now we're starting to hear a buzz about, okay, well, this happened again, so now are they valuing the kids' lives now that it's happened a couple of times, or are they not? Or can we make predictions? And that's what culture of remembrance is, and that's what the value that the program brings to people like us that go through this, and what we can exchange and bring back to society.
Clarice, as Earl just talked about the culture of remembrance, I'm concerned that while we are promoting this culture, we see the lack of civic engagement in the classrooms. We see a growing number of professors in higher education walking away from tenured positions because they can't teach history. We see teachers walking away from classrooms because they can't teach the history of America. And so we're going to have a generation, if in fact this pattern continues, we're going to have a generation of young people who have no clue about their own history, because the history of African Americans in this country, or Hispanics or women, is all American history. So how can we play a greater role, a much more aggressive role in education to make sure that the next generation of children are educated and do understand the power of history? Clarice?
I often think about that question, and the only way, because I know this whole movement of CRT is like infiltrating our educational spaces, which is so off course, because CRT is a higher level of thinking. It's a legal type conversation about systems, and it's not something that it should be, that we are even teaching in our lower education, which we may need to, because at this point, our children need to know what's going on. I'm talking about critical race theory. I don't see in our educational systems that this issue of the history being taught getting better. I really feel like it's going backwards. So I feel like that it has to be a radical, first of all, parents. I mean, we really have to be at home with it and educating our own children, our communities, as a collective, need to be able to teach the narratives correctly to the population. We're not gonna see it in education. I doubt it. We may have some groups across the country in education, other than higher education, that can teach that. But I think as a grassroots foundational type implementation, it has to be home and communal, in my opinion. I just don't see it happening. I think we get a lot of kickback politically for doing it. Like you said, there are a lot of people leaving. There are a lot of educators leaving education because we're not able to tell the truth. There's no truth-telling happening, and everybody's afraid. And they're getting, and rightfully so, because they're getting backlash for doing so. They're losing their jobs. They're being, listed for being this revisionist, for teaching, outside of the script. And it's not going to come from from the inside of a building, I don't think. I think the revolutionary radical history teaching and truth-telling is going to come from the community. It's going to come from the homes of people, parents, grandparents, families. I think that's where we need to start. I think that's where it's going to come from. And I think when we have the Pulse Foundation, other organizations, grassroots organizations, we are going to have to be the forerunners of truth-telling and narrative presentation. That's how I feel about that. It's not going to be there. I think if we do that, it will trickle over to that we have no choice. I think there will be no choice but to have the conversations, because on the outside, the conversation is being had. The radical change is being had, and it has to come inward, because we're not going to sit in our seats in education and listen to somebody talking about stories in history and we know the truth. We're going to challenge them. Like Dr. Joyce said, they were physically removing people, professors, from rooms because you're not speaking the truth. Right. You're not connecting with what's happening in my community and what's happening right now. And I think it's going to come from the outside in. I don't think there is a top-down approach to this at all. The struggle is real right now. It's always been grassroots, and I think it's going to continue to be that. And then the people on the top will then understand. I think we need to meet in the middle.
And Clarice, if that's the case, then we should be able to mobilize those organizations, Pulse, Cultural Vistas, now, gay organizations, racial, civil rights. Why not have, white women, black women, Asian women, men, no matter economic persuasion? Can you imagine 332 million people in this country, and nearly 65% of us have progressive ideas? Why aren't we at the table together? That would be a powerful coalition. Poor women, wealthy women, across the board. And so I think we have to get back to some of that 1960s flavor. And I was one of the few African-American women active in NOW many years ago. And in spite of the fact that there were only a few of us, we still had a voice. And women have a way of working through, these egos. We don't let all of that get in the way. We have a long history of working together. I'm not sure about the men in the audience. I'm not sure about men generally. Well, that's a whole nother conversation, but we need to find a way to break through those barriers and see the power of the entire community coming together and find that common ground. Even if we disagree on 5 of those issues and we can agree on 2 or 3, I think we can send the kind of voice, the kind of policy changes to the nation to understand that, in fact, we are going to memorialize the sanctity of life and that we're not going to allow 400 million guns in a country that calls itself the most powerful in the world. Why does anybody need an AR-15? Why do we need to even talk about it? I am really sick and tired of the conversations around whether it's 21 or 18. I don't care if you're 91, you don't need an AR-15. You don't need a gun at all. You know, why not simply have the military, even if they don't need guns, if we have a progressive country. So I think we, again, have to say those things in a very direct, clarifying way. Why does anyone need an AR-15 or a gun in this country? I'd like to hear from you, Sue, again. Is there any mobilization of those groups, those affinity groups that deal with these issues in Hamburg or in Germany generally? I know you guys have a number of progressive policies in terms of hatred, in terms of racism and anti-Semitism, but talk about that a little, if in fact there's a mobilization.
Well, there is, but I think I wanted to add to the discussion 2 more things. One is that I would like to speak up a little bit for the younger generations, because I think even though it's sometimes, I think, because I'm also a generation which is a little bit in between, right? When I was around 20, then mobile phones came up and everything. But I think very often we think, when we look at classrooms and people are using their telephones and surfing and using Instagram and everything, that they look bored. But I think there's also a lot of activism which grows out of social media and technologies, which from the outside maybe doesn't look so much like confronting things with your bodies. But I think people are still very much engaged, and I feel like when I speak to a lot of younger people, but also people in my age, that people do have a lot more knowledge just because they have access to so many things when they go online, that I think activism is just changing. So I think we still need these really personal and real life encounters like we are sitting here right now, but then also with the DAICOR experience last year, I think having a mixture between, being here now and then we have a virtual audience. They can there are people from Germany now being able to join us here and to listen to our conversation, which wasn't really possible before. I mean, it was technically possible, but people didn't do it. So I think there are a lot of things going on at the moment, and we are in very interesting times, just because a lot of things are being challenged. There are a lot more opportunities through technology and everything. So I think the question is maybe more, how can we combine that? And I think the second thing is also again about the exchange program, because being in the US for me it's my second time, so I really don't know much about the US, but I think what was really interesting is also to step out of the frame of national thinking. I mean, even in Europe you have all these little countries, but then policies are still very much within a national frame or within a national framework. And I think that was interesting also about the exchange, to hear from so many people also internationally and how it is all connected. Because, for example, Clarice and I, we just talked about, before we started with the panel, that in Europe we very much talk about colonial history, just because obviously you had European colonialism, and that is the historical entry point to also talk about racist policies today. But then it is different again in the US, but it is connected with each other. So the history of enslavement European colonialism and what we deal with today, it is connected. So I think it's very important to get into this exchange that we have here now, and to connect these dots with each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We have about 5 minutes, if I could see that clock correctly, and wanted to give the audience an opportunity to raise any questions, issues, comments that you may have before we bring this panel to end. The young man with the beautiful hair.
Thank you. So my question is, should we challenge organizational structures in remembrance organizations that don't center or don't put impacted populations at the forefront? And how should we challenge that?
So you're presenting that to someone that's an activist, right? So I say challenge it. You have to, because you know what? You're probably, first of all, you're thinking something that somebody else is thinking that they're probably not saying, right? And if you notice it, if you see it, then say it, right? I think that comes from somewhere, but it is actually a fact. I think people, organizations need to be held accountable. And if they're polarizing thought, if you will, right, and it's not impacting the population that it should impact, well, then that's a flag that needs to be made, they need to be made aware of, I think.
I think I saw a hand next to you.
I actually just had a comment. Thank you so much for all of your work. This neighborhood that we're in is called Paramore. I just think it's maybe important to mention it for a minute. It's a very important historically African-American neighborhood in this area, which is actually named after a past mayor of Orlando who redlined this neighborhood, Paramore, and was extremely impacted financially by Jim Crow laws. And there's been some interesting work here lately, including this campus that we're on. I just wanted to ground us in this campus, which has been trying to work with Paramore to reduce multi-generational poverty in this area, with some mixed reviews. Some people who think there's a lot of gentrification and some people who think there's really good grassroots work going on. This construction across the street that you see is a park that's being put in, a memorial park, called Luminary Park, which is supposed to be statues in recognition of African-American people local to this neighborhood. So I just think it's interesting that this remembrance stuff, which I think many of us walk around all the time busy and not looking up or whatever, is all around us, internationally and in these Pulse. And I work for the Holocaust Museum. I run the Take Action Institute for them. But it's also just everywhere we step, and it's all around us. So and many of you are international and other visitors from around the States, I wanted to mention this beautiful community that you're in.
Any other questions, comments? I'm not sure I'm looking at the clock. Does that clock say 11:15 or 5?
Yes, it does say.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah. Hi.
oh, okay.
Hi. I have a question. You haven't talked about consent, and some of the victims are suing the owner of the Pulse nightclub and the Pulse nightclub, and you're building this museum in their honor, supposedly, but they haven't given consent to use their family's photos or any of these issues. And I think that's a really big issue. And the other issue that I have too is you're talking about revisionist history, and there's a lot of documents pointing to unpermitted renovations at the club. Victims had to jump over an unpermitted fence. And is that fence gonna be in the museum? Are you gonna gloss over that? These are issues that are very serious to our community. I used to go to Pulse. I have friends who were in the club that night, and it's very hard to see what's happening here. And you see the rainbows and the runs and all these things that are happening, and it's glossing over these serious issues, and it's very horrible. And that we have to fight and struggle, and our voices are not being heard, and they should be.
Yeah, so to that end, we're trying to incorporate a little bit more of that into the museum being built, and it's a struggle because we're trying to find balance in that. So it's something we're working on. It's something that we're working on, and the answers are out there. We're just working on finding them.
Well, I wanted to ask the young man that spoke earlier, and based on what Linda said in terms of technology and the social media connecting young people, are we using technology to connect, or is it separating us even more in terms of staying within our individual bubbles? I was wondering do you have a sense of young people being more connected through social media?
Well, thank you. So in my experience, like doing student activism, I've kind of not been doing it for that long, but I feel like I had felt that there was connection going on through social media, but an experience that kind of changed that line of thinking was I went to the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, Alabama, and witnessing the degree to which civil rights activists and student activists truly dedicated every moment of every hour to building connections and building community and doing activism. To me, that's something that just doesn't exist really within students. I've never met a student who I feel truly dedicates every minute of their day to building on their mission. And so I feel like that's an area where I aspire to create change.
Great to hear. Lori, how are we on another question?
Probably need to
I
wrap
have
it up.
Oh,
this one.
I think we have one more
And one
question.
I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be volunteering, but
No, go right ahead.
I work for the One Pulse Foundation. I'm new to the foundation, and I was just curious if you would give us some ideas on some of the things that how could we better connect with you and make you feel more included in what's going on? What are some of the things that we could do better?
Well, we've reached out throughout the years. We have a organization, it's a grassroots organization called CCAPM, Community Coalition Against the False Museum. And we're survivors and family members and community members who have been here since the beginning. And we just have been very vocal online on social media. And, it's not against, memorialization per se. We are all for a public memorial park. The problem is when the money's involved, $150,000 the owner's making every year in her own salary. And, when you take into consideration these unpermitted renovations and all these other issues that are documented, front page of the Orlando Sentinel, I have it printed out right here. Front page of the Orlando Sentinel, Pulse Remembrance unpermitted, So why is she making money off of this mass murder? It's disturbing, honestly. It's very disturbing.
So we will continue the dialogue. We want everybody to be heard, but we also want to keep everything going, so we're going to have to kind of end this panel.
Well, thank you, Lori, thank you. And I'm sure there will be an opportunity to continue that conversation with her all here. Well, thank you so much. You have been marvelous, very attentive, and I hope that we leave you with some inspiration.
All right. So I'm sure you all need to take a little bit of break. You have about 10 minutes to get to your first breakout session. For your own information, again, bathrooms are down to the hall to the right. At the breakout sessions, we have to actually go out of the double doors across the hall to another building over there, and the breakout rooms are to the right. We have volunteers standing by who will check you into your breakout rooms. Thank you.